Welcome to another exciting customer self-service video. Today we're going to talk about approval rules, specifically migrating our out-of-the-box supervisor approval rule to a cost center owner approval rule. Out of the box, we route requests to the supervisor and then up the chain of command, as it would be, to their supervisors until we reach someone with the correct delegation of authority or approval limit. A standard supervisor rule and chain rule associated with that supervisor rule drive that functionality. A lot of companies want to run more of a cost center approver option instead, so that all requests route to a cost center manager instead of routing to someone's supervisor. There's a variety of reasons for this, from budgetary expenses. Not all companies want this because it does end up routing a lot of smaller orders to the cost center manager, who's generally a pretty high level position. And so not all companies like to run this, but it is pretty common. And most companies, I would say, exclude this for projects. So if there's a project identified, it bypasses the cost center or supervisor approval rules and then goes to a separate lookup associated to the project itself. And so you have separate workflows for projects. So all these changes can be managed directly by you, the customer, in your SAP Ariba realm. And I'll actually do a short tutorial on how to make those changes. So we've logged into our SAP Ariba realm. We're going to go to the approval processes. Once we're there, we're going to search for the requisition. Could potentially be on a invoice reconciliation as well. And in this case, I'm just going to open one that's been assigned to me previously. Okay, so here we are on our standard approval rules here. You'll notice almost always there is the supervisor flow. So we're going to select it and just take a look at it. And you'll notice that it says if the first active supervisor is not null, if it's not equal to a project or an imported requisition, something like that, and it just says add supervisor, right? And that adds the person's first line supervisor. There's a couple of variations on this rule, the way that it's set up. So then you have the chain rule, and the chain rule here basically looks at the same thing, and it has this condition that says the total cost exceeds the approval limit of the approver in the base rule, and then it says add supervisor, and it simply adds the supervisor. And because it's a chain rule, it keeps running that rule until this condition, that the total cost doesn't exceed the approval limit of the approver. And so it's going to add supervisor 1, 2, 3, 4, and then stop on number 4 if they have the appropriate approval limit. And so that is how the standard out-of-the-box rule works. To change this, right, add a serial rule here. We'll call this cost center owners or something of that sort. Description will be adds cost center owner. For all intents and purposes, we can leave this condition as is. If you wanted to, you could do a field match or a predefined condition, depending on how it's set up in your realm, and say that if you have a project, right, or if it's a imported requisition, bypass this approval. And so for instance here, we'll just use the is imported rec, and I can say is equal to false, right, or equal to no in this case. And so if it's imported, right, we want to bypass the approvals because that rec's already been approved or is imported from an approved system, so we can bypass that. Similarly, you could say, if it has a project code identified, bypass this rule. Now, the real change here is instead of using an approver group or supervisor, right, like the supervisor, etc., so we're going to use this approval lookup table. And you'll notice that it's a little bit different. The first thing that you have to do is actually define which fields you want to drive the lookup off of, right? So one handy thing is if you click on internal field name, it will put them in alphabetical order, which is a little bit better than having them in the random order like they were. We're going to choose line items and then line item accountings. And then in this particular case, we're going to do a line item split accountings. And then we're going to choose the cost center, and then I'm going to choose OK. And in this particular case, you'll now notice this cost center field down here, right? Some companies call cost centers departments, etc. You can drive this on any of the accounting fields you want. It doesn't have to be cost center. And here you'll notice that I have a group. identified. I'm actually going to say I want a user identified. Then you'll export the column headers. It's going to open a Excel file, or really a CSV file. And so now I've got my basic format, and so I can say if it's cost center, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then I'm going to route this to John Smith. And so you type in the username there. And so obviously you're generally going to import this from your financial system. There is a way to import helper files. We'll do a separate video on that. And so you can import this from your financial systems. The one thing that I will say is, if there's no cost center manager, you're going to put an asterisk at the end of this file and generally do an approver field path. You can get the actual field names just like this. If you go here to add a column, you can actually go and say, I want the requester's supervisor. So I can scroll down here to the requester, open that up, scroll down to requester supervisor. And so here we're just going to choose the requester supervisor. And so very similarly, I can go back to my file and actually put in the requester supervisor. Apparently that didn't paste well, but we can also just type it in, requester.supervisor. And for required, if you want them to be an approver, it's going to be true. If you want them to be a watcher, it's going to be false. You can also add the group here, and instead of routing it to their supervisor, I can route it to the customer administrator. And so I can route it over to the customer administrator or a different group that handles, if there's not a cost center manager identified, then you're just going to route it to that group to handle. Similarly, if I choose this actions button here, right, and say chain this rule, then I can actually put in the predefined condition that we talked about before. The total cost exceeds approval limit of approver. I can select that, hit OK, and then simply add the supervisor of the approver. So in this particular case, it would go to the cost center owner and then up their approval chain if it exceeded their authority. Some companies don't do that. The cost center manager is the final approver for all financials for that cost center. It doesn't have to go through a full delegation of authority. At other companies, they actually have two different tables. So in theory, you could not run the chain rule and have a second table that says, if the total cost exceeds this amount, then route it to this additional cost center manager or approver that would be different than the first one. And obviously you would just delete this supervisor rule, and now you have a cost center routing instead of the supervisor routing, where we're going to route this directly through. If you are the administrator and you just need to update this file, you can actually go to Core Administration, Customization Manager, Approval Process Files, and then you can find your approval process file that you're looking for here, and then upload it directly instead of having to do anything else. Similarly, you can integrate that, and there's actually an option to do an API call. So instead of maintaining the table here, you can actually do an API call out to your financial management system to get those approvers as well. And so those are all also options. If you need some of those more advanced features or functions, contact your CE and they'll be happy to reach out and get someone that can help you with those more advanced features and setup.